Chapter 33. So I started for town in the wagon, and I was halfway I see a wagon coming, and sure enough it was Tom Sawyer, and I stopped and waited till he come along, and I says, "Hold on!" And it stopped alongside, and his mouth opened up like a trunk, and stayed so. And he swallowed 2 or 3 times like a person that's got a dry throat, and then says, "I ain't never done you no harm, you know that. So then why you want to come back and hunt me for?" And I says, "I ain't come back. I ain't been gone." When he heard my voice, it righted him up some, but he still weren't quite satisfied, and he says, "Don't you play nothing on me, 'cause I wouldn't on you. Honest Injun, you ain't a ghost?" "Honest Injun, I ain't," I says. "Well, I, well, that ought to settle it, of course. But I can't seem to understand it looking no way. Now, weren't you murdered at all?" "No, I weren't never murdered at all. I played it on him. You come in here and feel of me if you don't believe me." So he done it, and it satisfied him. Then he was glad to see me again. He didn't know what to do. And he wanted to know all about it right off because it was a grand adventure and mysterious. And so it hit him right where he lived. But I said leave it alone till by and by, and told his driver to wait, and we drove off a little piece, and I told him the kind of fix I was in, and what did he reckon we better do. And he said let him alone a minute and don't disturb him. So he thought and thought and thought, and pretty soon he says, "It's all right. I've got it. Take my trunk in your wagon and let on at shorn. And you turn back and fool along slow so as to get to the house about the time you ought to. And I'll go towards town a piece and take a fresh start and get there about a quarter or half an hour after you do. And you needn't let on that you know me at first." And I says, "Well, all right, but wait a minute. There's one more thing. A thing that nobody don't know but me. And that is, there's a slave here that I'm a-trying to steal out of slavery. And his name is Jim. Old Miss Watson's Jim." And he says, "What? Why, Jim it—" And he stopped and went a-studying. And I says, "I know what you'll say. You'll say it's a dirty, low-down business. But what if it is? I'm low-down, and I'm going to steal him. And I want you to keep mum and let on, and not let on. Will you?" He lit up one eye, and then he says, as he lit up the other, "Well, I help you steal him." Well, I let go all holts then, like I was shot. It was the most astonishing speech I ever heard. And I'm bound to say Tom Sawyer fell considerable in my estimation. Only I couldn't believe it. Tom Sawyer is a slave stealer. "Oh, shucks," I says. "You're joking." "I ain't joking either." "Well then," I says, "joking or no joking, if you hear anything about a runaway slave, don't forget to remember that you don't know nothing about him. And I don't know nothing about him." And then he took the trunk and put it in my wagon, and he drove his off away, and I drove mine. But of course I forgot all about driving slow on account of being so glad and full of thinking. But I got home a heap too quick for that length of trip. And the old gentleman, he was at the door, and he says, "Why, ain't it wonderful? Whoever thought it was in the old mare to do it? I wish we'd have timed her. And she ain't sweated a hair, not a hair. It's wonderful. Why, I wouldn't take $100 for that horse now. I wouldn't, honest. And yet I'd have sold her for 15 before, and thought that was all she was worth." And that's all he said. He was the innocentest old best soul I ever see. But it weren't surprising, 'cause he weren't only just a farmer. He was a preacher, too, and had a little one-horse log church down back of the plantation, which he built it himself at his own expense, for a church and a schoolhouse, and never charged nothing for his preaching. And it was worth it, too. And there was plenty of other farmer preachers like that, down south, same way. In about a half an hour, Tom's wagon drove up to the front stile, and Aunt Sally see it through the window, because it was only about 50 yards, and she says, "Why, there's Somebody come. Wonder who it is. I do believe it's a stranger. Jimmy, that's one of the children. Run tell Liz put on another plate for dinner. Everybody made such a rush for the front door because, of course, a stranger don't come every year. And so he lays over the yellow fever for interest. And when he does come, well, Tom was over the stile and starting for the house, and the wagon was spinning up the road for the village, and we was all bunched in at the front door. Tom had his store clothes on, and an audience. And that was always nuts for Tom Sawyer. In them circumstances, it weren't no trouble for him to throw in a man out of style that was suitable. He weren't a boy to meekly along up that yard like sheep. No, he had come, and he important, and he come important, like a ram. When he got in front of us, he lifts his hat ever so gracious and dainty, like it was the lid of a box that had butterflies asleep in it, and he didn't want to disturb them. And he says, "Mr. Archibald Nichols, I presume?" "No, no, my boy," says the old gentleman. "I'm sorry to say your driver has deceived you. Nichols's place is down a matter about 3 mile more. Come on in, come in." Tom, he looked back over his shoulder and says, "It's too late. He's out of sight." "Yes, he's gone, my son. But you must come in and eat your dinner with us. And then we'll hitch up and we'll take you down to the Nicholses." "Oh, I can't make you make so much trouble. I wouldn't think of it. I'll walk. I don't mind the distance." "But we won't let you walk. It wouldn't be Southern hospitality to do it. Come right on in." "Oh, do," says Aunt Sally. "It ain't a bit of trouble for us, not in a bit in the world. You must stay. It's a long, dusty 3 mile, and we can't let you walk it. And besides, we've already told him to put on another plate when I see you was a-comin'. So you mustn't disappoint us. Come right in and make yourself at home." So Tom, he thanked everyone very hearty and handsome, let himself be persuaded, and he come in, and when he was in, he said he was a stranger from Hicksville, Ohio, and his name was William Thompson, and he made another bow. Well, he run on and on and on and on, making up stuff about Hicksville and everybody in it he could invent, and I was getting a little nervous and wondering how this was going to help me get out of my scrape. And then at last, still talking, he reached over and kissed Aunt Sally right on the mouth, and then settled back in his chair comfortable and was going on talking, but she jumped up and wiped off the back of her hand and says, "You audacious puppy!" Well, he looked kind of hurt and says, "I'm surprised at you, ma'am." "You're What do you reckon I am? I've a good notion to take and say, what do you mean by kissing me?" He looked kind of humble and says, "I didn't mean nothing, ma'am. I didn't mean no harm. I thought you'd like it." "Why, you old fool! You born a fool!" She took up the spinning tick and looked like for all it was worth she was going to give him a crack with it. "What made you think I'd like it?" "Why, I don't know. Only they told me they would." "They told you I would? Whoever told you is another lunatic. Why, I never heard the beat of it. Who's they?" "Why, everybody. They all said so, ma'am." It was all she could do to hold in. Her eyes snapped and her fingers worked like she wanted to scratch him. And she says, "Who's everybody? Out with their names, or there'll be an idiot short." Well, he got up and looked distressed and fumbled his hat and says, I'm sorry. I weren't expecting it. They told me to. They all told me to. They all said, kiss her, and said she'd like it. They all said it, every one of them. But I'm sorry, ma'am, I won't do it no more. I won't, honest." "You won't you?" "Well, I should reckon you won't." "No, man, I'm honest about it. I won't ever do it again. Till you ask me." "Till I ask you? Well, I never seen the beat of it in all my born days. I'll lay you'll be with Methuselah Numbskull of the creations before I ever ask you, or the likes of you." "Well," he says, "it does surprise me so. I can't make it out somehow. They said you would, and I thought you would, but... He stopped and looked around slow, like he wished he could run across a friendly eye somewheres, and fetched up on the old gentleman, and says, "Didn't you think she'd like me to kiss her, sir?" "Why, no, no, I believe I didn't." Then he looks around on the same way to me and says, "Tom, didn't you think Aunt Sally would put her arms around and say, 'Sid Sawyer'?" "My land," she says, breaking in and jumping in. "You impudent young rascal! You fool a body so!" And was going to hug him. But he fended her off. "No, no, not till you've asked me first." Well, she didn't lose no time. But she asked him, and hugged him, and kissed him over and over again, and then turned him over to the old man. And he took what was left. And after they got a little quiet again, and she says, "Why, dear me, I never seen such a surprise. We weren't looking for you at all, only Tom. Sis never wrote me about anybody else a coming but him." And Tom, he says, "That's because it wasn't intended for anybody else to come but Tom." He says, "But I begged, and at the last minute she let me come too. So, coming down the river, me and Tom thought it'd be a first-rate surprise for him to come in here to the house first, and for me to by and by tag along and drop in later, and let on be a stranger. But that was a mistake, Aunt Sally. This ain't no healthy place for a stranger to come." "No, not impudent whelps," said. "You ought to have your jaws boxed. I ain't been put out so since I don't know when. But I don't care. I don't mind the terms. I'd be willing to stand 1,000 such jokes to have you here. Well, to think of that performance! I don't deny it. It was the most putrefied and astonishment I ever see when you give me that smack." We had dinner out in that broad open passage betwixt the house and the kitchen, and there were things enough on that table for 7 families, and all hot too. None of your flabby tough meat that's laid in a cupboard in the damp cellar all night and tastes like a hunk of old cold cannibal from the next morning. Uncle Silas, he asked a pretty long blessing over it, but it was worth it, and it didn't cool it a bit neither, the way I've seen them do when them kind of interruptions do it most of the times. There was a lot of considerable good deal of talk that afternoon, and me and Tom was on the lookout all the time, but it weren't no use. They didn't happen to say nothing about no runaway slave. We was afraid to try to work up to it. But at supper that night, one of the little boys says, "Pa, mayn't Tom and Sid and me go to the show?" "No," says the old man. "I reckon there ain't going to be any. And you couldn't go if there was, because the runaway slave told Burton and me all about that scandalous show. And Burton said he would tell the people. So I reckon they've drove off the old doefish loafers out of town before this time." So there it was. But I couldn't help it. Tom and me was to sleep in the same room in the bed. And so, being tired, we bid good night and went up to bed and climbed right in after supper. And then we climbed out the window, down the lightning rod, and shoved for the town. For I didn't believe anybody was going to give the king and duke a hint. So if I didn't hurry up and give them one, they'd get into trouble for sure. On the road, Tom, he told me all about it, and how he reckoned I was murdered, and how Pap disappeared pretty soon and didn't come back no more, and what a stir there was when Jim run away. And I told Tom all about the Royal Nonesuch rapscallions, and as much of the raft voyage as I had time to, and we struck out into the town and up through the middle of it, and it was as much as after 8 then. And here comes along a raging rush of people with torches and an awful whooping and yelling and banging tin pans and blowing horns, and we jumped to one side to let them go on by. And as they went by, I see they had the king and the duke astraddle of a rake. It was as much as half after 8 then. Here comes a ragged rush of people with torches and a whooping and a yelling and banging tin pans and blowing horns, and we jumped to one side to let them go by. And when we went by, I see they had the king and the duke all astraddle a rail, That is, I knowed it was the king and the duke, though they was all over tar and feathers, and didn't look nothing in the world like that was a human. Just looked like a couple of monstrous big soldier plumes. Well, it made me sick to see it. I was sorry to see them poor pitiful rascals, and it seemed like I couldn't ever feel any hardness against them any more in the world. It was dreadful to see. Human beings can be awful cruel to one another. We see we was too late, couldn't do no good. We asked some stragglers about it, and they said everybody went to the show looking very innocent, and laid low and kept dark till the poor old king was in the middle of his cavortings on the stage, and then someone give a signal, and the house rose up and went for him. So we poked along back home, and I weren't feeling so brash as I was before, but kind of ornery and humble, and to blame somehow, though I hadn't done nothing. But that's always the way. It don't make no difference whether you do the right thing or wrong. A person's conscience ain't got no sense, and it just goes for him anyway. If I had a yaller dog that didn't know no more than a person's conscience does, I would up and poison him. It takes up more room than all the rest of a person's insides. Yet it ain't no good, nohow. Tom Sawyer, he says the same.